How does a nation, having shed its blood for freedom, then fall to its knees and beg for the return of its chains? In the spring of 1814, the streets of Madrid were not filled with the solemn silence of a liberated but wounded people. They were filled with a roar, a carnival of joy. The French eagle, the banner of Napoleon, had finally been driven from the Iberian Peninsula. 6 years of brutal guerrilla warfare, of starvation and sacrifice, were over. And the people shouted a single name, a name that had become a symbol of their resistance, a holy icon of their stolen sovereignty. They shouted for Ferdinand VII. They called him El Deseado, the Desired One. But here lies the first chilling paradox of our story. Was it a king they were calling for, or a ghost they had invented? The man who returned from comfortable exile in a French chateau was not the noble symbol they imagined. He was a creature of profound mediocrity, defined by 3 qualities: a bottomless well of cowardice, a vindictive cruelty, and an almost pathological hatred for the very century in which he lived. The people of Spain had not just fought Napoleon, they had created a new Spain in the process. In 1812, in the besieged city of Cadiz, their brightest minds had forged one of the most liberal constitutions in European history. It established a constitutional monarchy, abolished feudalism, and curtailed the terrifying power of the Spanish Inquisition. It was a document born of gunpowder and enlightenment. Ferdinand's first act upon returning was not to thank his people, it was to spit on their sacrifice. He declared the constitution null and void, a document of heresy and treason. The promise of a new dawn was extinguished before it had even broken. The Desired One had returned, and he had brought the Middle Ages back with him. The terror did not begin with a bang, but with a whisper campaign orchestrated by his shadowy clique of advisors, the Camarilla. They were a collection of sycophants, religious fanatics, and career opportunists who understood their king's deepest fear, that the world had moved on without him. So they began the Great Purge. Liberals, constitutionalists, war heroes who had fought the French, academics, artists, anyone touched by the French disease of modern thought was a target. A secret police force, a more insidious and modern beast than the old Inquisition, was born. Its agents were everywhere, in taverns, in universities, in the confessionals. A neighbor's denunciation, a jealous rival's anonymous letter was enough to drag a man from his home in the dead of night. And where did they go? They went to the revived dungeons of the Holy Office. The Inquisition, which the rest of Europe considered a Gothic relic, was back in business. Its purpose was no longer just religious purity, it was political cleansing. Torture was not a bug in Ferdinand's system, it was the central feature. The rack, the water cure, the slow crushing of bones, these were not instruments to extract truth, but to inflict pain as a public lesson. The greatest lie of power is that it seeks order. Often, it seeks only the validation of its own paranoia. Ferdinand's Spain became a nation holding its breath, a place where Goya's dark paintings ceased to be fantasy and became documentary. The king, a man who had licked Napoleon's boots in captivity, now postured as the great defender of Spanish tradition, a tradition he defined as absolute obedience to the throne and the altar. His personal life was a mirror of his public policy, a grotesque theatre of incompetence and sadism. He married 4 times, desperate for an heir, treating his wives with a mixture of cloying sentimentality and cold cruelty. He was notoriously lazy, spending his days on trivialities while the Spanish Empire crumbled abroad. The colonies in the Americas, seeing the return of absolutism, broke away one by one, launching their own wars of independence. Spain, once a global power on which the sun never set, was reduced to a second-rate European nation, bleeding golden influence. Ferdinand's response was not reform or diplomacy, but impotent rage. He ordered doomed expeditions to reconquer the colonies, sending thousands of soldiers to die of disease in forgotten jungles, all to soothe his wounded pride. What is more terrifying? A tyrant who believes he is a genius, or one who knows he is a fraud and must kill to hide the fact? Ferdinand was the latter. He hated the heroes of the War of Independence because they had shown a courage he could never possess. He despised the intellectuals because they wielded an intelligence he could never grasp. His reign was a long, slow national act of self-harm, a vendetta against his own people's potential. He was not protecting tradition, he was embalming a corpse and forcing an entire country to worship it. Every university was a potential source of sedition, every book a potential carrier of dangerous ideas. He famously declared that the universities should be closed and replaced with schools of bullfighting. It was not just a joke, it was a mission statement. His cruelty had a petty, personal flavor. He would personally review execution lists, taking a rumored delight in signing the death warrants of men he had once known. He restored the Jesuit order not out of piety, but because he knew their network of spies and informants would be invaluable. He governed through a system of patronage that rewarded loyalty over competence, ensuring that his administration was staffed by the most corrupt and reactionary elements of society. The Spanish economy, already devastated by war, stagnated and then collapsed. Famine stalked the countryside while the court indulged in lavish ceremonies. This was not the grandeur of a powerful empire, it was the frantic, gaudy display of a regime terrified of its own illegitimacy. Ferdinand was a black hole at the center of his country, consuming light, hope, and progress. The tragic irony is that he succeeded. He ruled for nearly 2 decades, dying in his bed in 1833. He left behind a country fractured, impoverished, and on the brink of a series of brutal civil wars that would plague it for over a century. The seeds of the Spanish Civil War of the 20th century were sown in the dungeons of Ferdinand VII. He had not just turned back the clock, he had broken it. The people had desired a savior, and in their desperation, they had crowned a monster. And this raises the most uncomfortable question of all. Does a people ever truly get the ruler it deserves? The adoration of a populace can be a potent drug, one that can transform a flawed man into a tyrant. Ferdinand was a known quantity, a predictable brute whose toxicity stemmed from his limitations. But what happens when the poison is not born of weakness, but of a sudden, shattering break from reality? What happens when the object of a nation's worship is not a petty king, but a young man hailed as a living god, a man who begins as a promise of sunshine and ends as a maelstrom of blood and madness? We have seen what happens when a nation welcomes back its past. Now we must journey back in time to the heart of an empire that believed itself to be the entire world, to witness what happens when a ruler decides he is the future. Ferdinand's reign was a slow, grinding terror. But in ancient Rome, the terror arrived like a fever dream. The problem wasn't that the ruler was a monster from the start. The problem was that he wasn't. He was loved. He was Gaius Julius Caesar, Augustus Germanicus. The soldiers who adored his father had given him a childhood nickname from the little military boots he wore. They called him Caligula. And when he ascended to the throne in the year 37, the entire Roman world exhaled in relief. The reign of the gloomy and paranoid Tiberius was over. In his place was a handsome, charismatic 24-year-old youth, the last direct descendant of the divine Augustus. The first 7 months of his reign were, by all accounts, a golden age. Caligula was the people's emperor. He abolished Tiberius's treason trials, a tool of political terror that had paralyzed the Roman elite. He burned incriminating files in public, declaring an end to the era of spies and informants. He granted bonuses to the Praetorian Guard, staged lavish games and chariot races for the public, and recalled political exiles. He was a breath of fresh air, a symbol of rejuvenation for an empire weary of fear. He was everything a Roman could want, pious, generous, and seemingly devoted to the traditions of the Republic. The Senate showered him with honors, the people sang his praises in the streets. It seemed too good to be true, and it was. In October of the year 37, the emperor fell gravely ill. The nature of the sickness is lost to history, perhaps encephalitis, perhaps a nervous breakdown under the immense pressure of his new role. The entire empire prayed for his recovery. And he did recover, but the man who rose from his sickbed was not the same man who had entered it. Something inside him had fractured. The charming youth was gone, replaced by something dark, unpredictable, and terrifyingly powerful. The golden age was over. The nightmare had begun. The poison of absolute power, perhaps catalyzed by his illness, had finally seeped into his soul. His transformation was not gradual. It was a violent schism in his personality. He began by blurring the lines between man and God, a line that even the most arrogant of his predecessors had respected. He started appearing in public dressed as various deities: Hercules, Apollo, Neptune. He demanded that a bridge be built connecting his palace on the Palatine Hill to the Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline, so that he could consult with the god as an equal. He then declared that he was not merely a representative of the gods, but a living god himself, Jupiter Latiaris. He had the heads of famous statues of gods replaced with his own likeness and ordered that a temple be erected to his own divinity. For the Romans, this was shocking. For the Jews in the eastern provinces, his order to place a statue of himself in the temple in Jerusalem was an act of blasphemy that brought the region to the brink of open revolt. It was the first sign that his whims were now state policy, and that reality itself had to bend to his will. His megalomania was a voracious beast, and it needed to be fed with constant, escalating acts of self-deification. An emperor who believes he is a god does not need advisors. He needs worshippers, and those who refused to worship paid a terrible price. His cruelty, once dormant, now bloomed in grotesque and theatrical ways. Executions became a form of entertainment. He was said to have ordered condemned men to be slowly sawn in half while he calmly ate his lunch, complaining that the spectacle was poorly choreographed. He lamented that his reign was not marked by a great disaster, like the defeat of Varus's legions under Augustus, because history would have nothing memorable to say about him. He had a bizarre and sadistic sense of humor. At the games, instead of releasing criminals to the beasts, he would sometimes have members of the audience chosen at random and thrown into the arena. His most famous act of political theater was his relationship with his favorite horse, Incitatus. He gave the horse a marble stable, a jeweled collar, and a house staffed with servants. He would invite the horse to dinner parties where it was served oats mixed with gold flakes. The culmination of this bizarre affair was his announcement that he intended to make Incitatus a consul, the highest office in the Roman Republic. Historians have debated this for centuries. Was it the ultimate act of a madman, or was it a deeply cynical and calculated insult to the Roman Senate, a way of showing them that his horse was more valuable and competent than any of them? Could you maintain your own sanity in a world where the emperor's horse holds more power than the most respected senator? The imperial treasury, which had been full when he took power, was quickly drained by his lavish spending on games, triumphs, and insane construction projects like building a 2-mile-long floating bridge of boats across the Bay of Naples so he could ride his horse across it. To refill the coffers, he turned to extortion and murder. He revived the treason trials he had once abolished, but now they were a fiscal tool. Wealthy citizens were accused of imaginary crimes, executed, and their estates confiscated. He turned the imperial palace into a brothel, forcing the wives and daughters of senators to work there, with the profits going directly to him. He was said to have committed incest with his sisters, particularly his favorite, Drusilla, whom he deified after her death. His reign became a surreal spectacle of depravity and terror. He was the ultimate narcissist, a man whose entire world was a reflection of his own disordered mind. The Roman Empire, the most powerful entity on earth, was held hostage by the whims of a single, broken psyche. Power did not corrupt Caligula, it simply gave him a stage large enough to enact his pre-existing madness. The fear in Rome was palpable. No one was safe. A wrong word, a misplaced glance could lead to a gruesome death. The senators he humiliated, the guards he mocked, the citizens he terrorized, they all smiled and applauded, because the alternative was unthinkable. But the poison of fear has an antidote: desperation. After less than 4 years of his rule, the breaking point was reached. Those closest to him, the officers of his own Praetorian Guard, could no longer endure the constant threat and humiliation. Led by a tribune named Cassius Chaerea, whom Caligula constantly mocked for his high-pitched voice, a conspiracy was formed. On the 24th of January in the year 41, as Caligula was leaving a theatre, the conspirators struck. They cornered him in a secluded corridor and stabbed him to death. His wife and infant daughter were murdered shortly after, extinguishing his line forever. The mad god was dead. But his reign left a permanent scar on the Roman psyche. It was a terrifying lesson in the fragility of a system that placed absolute power in the hands of one man. The madness of one Roman became a lesson for those who followed, but not all learned it. Some learned not to avoid cruelty, but to perfect it, to strip it of its manic impulsiveness and forge it into a cold, rational instrument of state. A millennium and a half later, on the other side of Europe, in a land of dark forests and warring nobles, a ruler would ascend to a throne whose cruelty was not a symptom of madness, but a meticulously calculated strategy for survival. His name was Vlad, and he would teach the world a new definition of terror. The scene shifts to the 15th century, to the brutal, chaotic landscape of Wallachia, a small principality squeezed between two voracious empires, the Kingdom of Hungary and the Ottoman Sultanate. This was a land where power was not inherited in peaceful succession. It was seized with a bloody sword and held with a clenched fist. The local nobles, the boyars, were a nest of vipers, constantly plotting, betraying, and assassinating for their own gain. Into this cauldron of violence stepped a man who had been forged in it, Vlad III of the House of Draculeti. His early life was a lesson in cruelty. As a boy, he and his brother were sent as political hostages to the Ottoman court, where he witnessed firsthand the absolute power and ruthless efficiency of the Sultan. He learned that mercy was weakness and that fear was the only language his enemies would truly understand. When he finally seized the Wallachian throne, he brought this lesson home with him. His goal was simple and absolute: to impose order on his fractured land and to defend it from the existential threat of the Ottomans. His methods, however, were anything but simple. They were a form of political theatre so grotesque, so profoundly terrifying, that his name would echo through the centuries as a synonym for monstrous evil. He became known as Vlad the Impaler. Impalement was not his invention, but he perfected it, elevated it from a mere method of execution to a tool of psychological warfare and state policy. It was a slow, agonizing death. A sharpened stake, often greased, was inserted into the victim's body and then raised upright, allowing the person's own weight to slowly drive the stake deeper, piercing internal organs over hours or even days. Vlad did not perform this act in the secrecy of a dungeon. He did it in public, on a scale that defied imagination. After a key victory against an invading Ottoman army, he had an estimated 20,000 captured Turkish soldiers impaled in a vast field outside the city of Targovi. When the pursuing Sultan, Mehmed the Conqueror, arrived with his main army, he was not met with soldiers, but with a forest of the dead. Thousands of decaying bodies writhing on stakes, a silent, stinking testament to Vlad's ferocity. The sight was so horrifying that even the battle-hardened Mehmed, the man who had conquered Constantinople, reportedly turned back in disgust. This was not the work of a madman losing control. It was the work of a cold, calculating strategist sending a message. This land will cost you more than you are willing to pay. A state built on skulls is a brutal monument, but a state built on fear requires no stones at all. It builds itself in the minds of its enemies. His war on the Ottomans was matched by an equally brutal war on the internal enemies of his state, the treacherous boyars and the criminal elements that plagued his cities. He saw corruption and disorder as a cancer that had to be burned out. Soon after taking power, he invited hundreds of boyars to a grand feast. After they had eaten and drunk, he asked them how many princes they had lived under. Most proudly boasted of having served many, a testament to their political maneuvering. and disloyalty. Vlad then had them all arrested. The older ones were impaled on the spot. The younger, healthier ones were marched to the ruins of a castle and forced to rebuild it with their bare hands, working until their fine clothes fell off and they died of exhaustion. He had an almost puritanical obsession with honesty and order. To test his subjects, he was said to have placed a golden cup in the middle of a town square, declaring that anyone could drink from it, but it must not be moved. Throughout his entire reign, the cup was never stolen. Was this a sign of a new moral order, or a sign of a populace so terrified that they would not dare to even think of committing a crime? What value does virtue have when it is enforced by the threat of unspeakable agony? The tales of his cruelty became legendary, blurring the line between history and folklore. He was said to have invited all the poor, sick, and vagrant people of his land to another great feast. After they had eaten their fill, he boarded up the hall and burned them all alive, declaring that he had rid his land of poverty and suffering and ensured no one would be a burden to others. When 2 Ottoman envoys refused to remove their turbans in his presence, citing religious custom, he praised them for their devotion and then had their turbans nailed to their heads so they would never have to remove them. These stories, whether literally true or not, painted a portrait of a ruler who wielded cruelty with a kind of grim, theatrical wit. His sadism was not random, it was performance art. He once dined in his forest of the impaled, dipping his bread in the blood that dripped from the victims. When an attendant recoiled at the smell of death, Vlad had him impaled on a much higher stake so the stench would not bother him. This was not just punishment, it was a terrifying lesson in absolute power. He was demonstrating that he was so far beyond the normal bounds of humanity that he could feast amidst a scene from hell itself. Yet, in his own country, and even today, Vlad Dracula is often remembered not as a monster, but as a national hero. A ruthless but just ruler who defended his people's independence against impossible odds. He was a founder of Bucharest, a staunch defender of Christianity against the expansion of Islam, a man who brought order to a lawless land. This is the enduring paradox of his reign. His methods were monstrous, but his goals were, from a certain perspective, noble. He was a product of his violent times, and he used the tools available to him. He understood that in a world of wolves, a shepherd cannot afford to be a sheep. The horror he unleashed was a strategic choice, a calculated application of terror to achieve political ends. Unlike Caligula, whose cruelty was a symptom of a disintegrating mind, Vlad's was the product of a sharp and focused one. He remains a chilling example of how the line between savior and monster can be perilously thin. The terror he crafted was a means to an end. But what happens when terror becomes the end in itself? What happens when cruelty is not a tool of statecraft but a form of artistic expression? For that we must return to Rome, to an emperor who saw his city burn and may have seen not a tragedy, but an opportunity for a great performance. His name was Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, but the world would come to know him as Nero. He ascended to the throne at the age of 16, a handsome, artistically inclined youth, guided by his ambitious mother, Agrippina, and his wise tutors, the philosopher Seneca and the Praetorian prefect, Burrus. For the first 5 years, his reign was considered a model of good governance. The empire was at peace, the Senate was respected, and justice was administered fairly. But beneath this placid surface, a toxic narcissism was festering. Nero did not want to be a good ruler, he wanted to be a great artist. He saw himself as a peerless poet, a masterful musician, and a thrilling chariot racer. The duties of state were a tedious distraction from his true calling, the pursuit of applause, and anything that stood between him and the stage had to be removed. The first to go was his stepbrother Britannicus, a potential rival to the throne, poisoned at a dinner party. The next was his own mother. Agrippina, who had schemed and murdered to put her son in power, made the fatal mistake of trying to control him. After a series of comically failed assassination attempts, including a collapsible boat designed to sink, Nero finally had his guards stab her to death. He had cleared the stage, and now his performance could begin. The poison of power for Nero was not megalomania, but a desperate, insatiable need for an audience. His artistic ambitions were an embarrassment to the Roman elite. The idea of an emperor performing on a public stage, singing and playing the lyre like a common entertainer, was scandalous. But Nero craved the adoration of the crowd. He forced senators and their wives to attend his recitals, which could last for hours. Guards were posted at the exits to prevent anyone from leaving. The chronicles tell of men feigning death just to be carried out of the theatre. He competed in the Olympic Games in Greece, entering every contest and miraculously winning every one. The judges understood that giving the emperor anything less than first prize would be a fatal career move. His obsession with his own perceived talent was absolute. He wasn't just an emperor who dabbled in the arts. He was an artist who happened to be emperor, and he used his imperial power to ensure he always got a standing ovation. This fusion of absolute power and artistic vanity created a uniquely dangerous form of tyranny. It was not enough to be obeyed, he had to be admired. And those who failed to show sufficient admiration found themselves accused of treason. A lukewarm review could be a death sentence. Then, in the summer of the year 64, came the event that would forever define his reign, the Great Fire of Rome. The blaze raged for 6 days, destroying vast swathes of the city. The historian Tacitus, our most reliable source, reports that Nero was away from Rome when the fire started and that he returned to organize relief efforts, opening his palaces to the homeless and bringing in food supplies. But a more potent and damning rumor quickly spread that the emperor had watched the city burn from a high tower, playing his lyre and singing about the fall of Troy. The story of Nero fiddling while Rome burned became an indelible image of callous indifference. But what if it was worse than that? What if he didn't just watch the fire, but started it? The rumor mill claimed he wanted to clear land to build a lavish new palace, his Domus Aurea, or Golden House. Whether accident or arson, the fire presented Nero with a political crisis. The devastated populace needed a scapegoat, and Nero provided one. He blamed the fire on a small, obscure religious sect that was viewed with suspicion by many Romans, the Christians. What followed was the first state-sponsored persecution of Christianity, and Nero, the artist, ensured it was a spectacle of cruelty. The punishments were not simple executions, they were theatrical productions of sadism. Christians were dressed in animal skins and torn apart by dogs in the arena. They were crucified. Most horrifically, they were coated in pitch, tied to stakes in Nero's gardens, and set ablaze to serve as human torches to illuminate his evening parties. He had turned murder into a form of macabre entertainment, a bloody backdrop for his social gatherings. This was not the calculated terror of Vlad the Impaler, designed to intimidate enemies. This was the cruelty of a decadent artist, using human lives as props in his grotesque masterpiece. He was not just killing people, he was creating a performance out of their death. The rest of his reign descended into a spiral of paranoia and bloodshed. He forced his tutor Seneca to commit suicide. He murdered his wife Poppaea by kicking her to death while she was pregnant. Then, in a bizarre act of mourning, he found a young castrated slave named Sporus who bore a resemblance to Poppaea, and he formally married him in a public ceremony, forcing Sporus to dress as the dead empress. The Roman world was no longer a state, it was the stage for one man's psychodrama. Is the tyrant who kills for a political reason more or less monstrous than the one who kills for a beautiful line in a poem? The end came when the empire could no longer afford the ticket price for his show. A series of rebellions broke out in the provinces, led by powerful governors who had grown tired of his madness and extravagance. The Senate, which had long feared him, finally found its courage and declared him a public enemy. Abandoned by his guards and allies, Nero fled the city. Hiding in a villa with his enemies closing in, the great performer prepared for his final act. But even then, he could not bring himself to do the deed. He paced back and forth, lamenting his fate and finally had his personal secretary help him plunge a dagger into his throat. His famous last words were not those of a statesman or a soldier, but of the artist he had always believed himself to be. Qualis artifex pereo, what an artist dies in me. He had lived his life as a performance, and he died critiquing his own exit. He had burned a city, murdered his family, and terrorized an empire, all in the service of his own bloated ego. His fall was brought about by the elites he had both terrorized and scorned, a coalition of generals and senators who decided the show must not go on. The story of a ruler brought down by his own nobility is a common one. But sometimes a country is cursed with a leader whose downfall is precipitated not by greatness, but by a spectacular and historic incompetence, a man whose personal failings were so profound they inadvertently gave birth to the very idea of liberty. The narrative now shifts north across the Alps and the English Channel to the damp and perpetually quarrelsome island of Britain in the early 13th century. Here we meet a king who possessed none of Nero's artistic pretensions or Caligula's divine madness. His toxicity was of a more common, more human variety, a potent cocktail of greed, paranoia, and breathtaking incompetence. He was the fourth son of the formidable Henry II, and Eleanor of Aquitaine, a man never expected to rule. His own father had mockingly nicknamed him Lackland because, unlike his elder brothers, he was given no continental territories to command. His name was John. His entire life was defined by the chip on his shoulder. He grew up in the shadow of his legendary warrior brother, Richard the Lionheart. While Richard was off fighting in the Crusades, John stayed home, plotting to usurp the throne. He betrayed his father, he betrayed his brother, he betrayed his allies. His defining characteristic was a faithlessness so profound it was almost a form of art. When he finally became king after Richard's death, England quickly discovered that it was being ruled by the family failure. His reign was a relentless cascade of disasters, a masterclass in how to lose friends and alienate people. Great freedoms are sometimes born not from the vision of heroes, but from the unbearable failures of an insufferable tyrant. John's first and most catastrophic failure was military. He inherited the vast Angevin Empire, which stretched from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees. Within 5 years, he had lost almost all of it. Through a combination of strategic blunders, diplomatic ineptitude, and a general unwillingness to fight, he lost Normandy, Anjou, and most of his other French possessions to King Philip II of France. This was not just a military defeat, it was a national humiliation. The English barons, who held vast estates in Normandy, saw their wealth and power decimated. John had not just lost a war, he had lost their respect, and for a medieval king, that was a fatal blow. To fund his failed wars, he taxed England into poverty. He squeezed his barons with exorbitant feudal fees, seized church lands, and imposed crippling taxes on merchants. This was not the behavior of a strong king building a state. It was the desperate action of a man trying to plug the holes in a sinking ship, a ship he himself had scuttled. His greed was legendary. He was obsessed with accumulating treasure, not for the good of the kingdom, but for his own personal security. He trusted no one and believed that wealth was the only loyalty he could truly buy. His cruelty lacked the theatrical flair of the Roman emperors. It was petty, personal, and vindictive. He was notorious for his lecherous behavior, often taking the wives and daughters of his barons as hostages and then raping them. This was not just an act of lust, it was a calculated tool of political humiliation, a way to show his nobles that he had absolute power over their lives and their honor. His most infamous act of cruelty was reserved for his own family. His young nephew Arthur of Brittany had a stronger claim to the throne than he did. John captured the boy and had him imprisoned. Arthur's fate is uncertain, but the most credible accounts suggest John murdered him with his own hands and dumped the body in the River Seine. He was also known to starve his opponents to death in his dungeons, a slow and particularly horrifying form of execution. Matilda de Braos, the wife of a baron who had fallen out of favor, was locked in a cell with her son and given nothing but a sheaf of oats and a piece of raw bacon. They were found dead 11 days later, with Matilda having gnawed on her own son's shoulder in her desperate hunger. Could you live under a king whose justice system was indistinguishable from a back-alley vendetta? His tyranny eventually extended to the one power in Europe that even kings feared, the Church. After a dispute with Pope Innocent III over the appointment of the Archbishop of Canterbury, John was excommunicated, and the entire Kingdom of England was placed under interdict. Churches were closed, bells fell silent, and the dead were buried in unconsecrated ground. For the deeply religious people of medieval England, this was a spiritual catastrophe. John held out for years, seizing church revenues for his own use, until the threat of a French invasion, sanctioned by the Pope, forced him to capitulate in the most humiliating way imaginable. He not only accepted the Pope's choice for archbishop, but also surrendered his entire kingdom to the papacy, receiving it back as a papal fiefdom. The King of England was now officially a vassal of the Pope. For the proud English barons, this was the final straw. Their incompetent king had lost their lands, taxed them into penury, dishonored their families, and now he had sold their country's sovereignty to a foreign priest. They had had enough. In 1215, they rose in open rebellion, not to overthrow the king, but to force him to obey the law. The result of this rebellion was one of the most important documents in the history of the Western world. At a meadow called Runnymede, the barons forced King John to affix his seal to a Charter of Liberties, a document they called the Magna Carta. For the first time, a European monarch had been compelled to agree in writing that he was not above the law. The charter established that no free man could be imprisoned or punished without a trial by his peers, and that the king could not levy new taxes without the consent of the kingdom. Most of its clauses dealt with specific feudal grievances, but these core principles, that the law applies to everyone, even the king, and that there should be no taxation without representation, would echo down the centuries. It was a revolutionary idea, born from the sheer desperation of men ruled by a uniquely terrible king. John had no intention of honoring the document. He repudiated it almost immediately, plunging the country into a civil war. But it was too late. The idea had been born. John died a year later of dysentery on the run from his enemies, his precious treasure lost in a tidal estuary. He died as he had lived, a failure, but his very failure was his most important legacy. His tyranny was so absolute, his incompetence so complete, that he forced his subjects to invent a new kind of politics, one based on law, not on the whims of a single, flawed man. England's barons had put a leash on their king, but in a vast, frozen land far to the east, a ruler was about to prove what happens when there is no leash at all. We travel now from the damp green fields of England to the immense, snow-covered forests of 16th century Muscovy. Here, a new kind of state was being forged, not through baronial consensus, but through the singular, terrifying will of one man. He was the first Russian ruler to be formally crowned with the title of Tsar, the Caesar of the Third Rome. He was a man of startling contradictions, a brilliant reformer and a paranoid sadist, a deeply pious man who saw himself as God's instrument, and a blood-soaked monster who took personal delight in torture. His name was Ivan IV, but history would remember him by a more evocative title, Ivan the Terrible. The word terrible in Old Russian did not mean evil, but rather awe-inspiring or formidable, a king who inspired both dread and respect. Over time, the dread would completely eclipse the respect. His reign, like that of Caligula, can be cleaved into two distinct parts: the bright promise of his youth and the dark, paranoid winter of his maturity. As a young ruler, advised by a council of wise men, Ivan was a visionary. He reformed the legal code, created a standing army, introduced local self-government, and conquered the Mongol Khanates of Kazan and Astrakhan, dramatically expanding the territory of his state. He was a builder, a modernizer, a unifier. But a series of personal tragedies, the death of his beloved first wife Anastasia, and the betrayal of his close friend Prince Kurbsky, who defected to the enemy, cracked the foundations of his mind. He became convinced he was surrounded by traitors, and his response was not to reform his government but to unleash a reign of terror, unlike anything his country had ever seen. In 1565, Ivan created a terrifying new institution, the oprichnina. It was a state within a state, a vast portion of Russian territory ruled directly by him outside the normal structures of government. And it had its own private army, the oprichniki. They were a brotherhood of about 6,000 men dressed in black, riding black horses and bearing a chilling insignia, a severed dog's head, and a broom. The symbolism was clear. They were there to sniff out treason and sweep it from the land. The oprichniki were Ivan's personal death squad, loyal only to him. They had the power to plunder and execute anyone they deemed a traitor without trial or appeal. They terrorized the boyar aristocracy, seizing their lands and murdering their families. But their violence quickly spilled over to engulf every level of society. They were a plague of black-clad horsemen, a law unto themselves, accountable only to the Tsar's increasingly unhinged paranoia. The oprichnina was not just a secret police, it was a functioning mechanism of state-sponsored terror, a way for Ivan to break the power of any potential opposition and rule through absolute, paralyzing fear. Russia was plunged into a 7-year nightmare of purges, mass executions, and wanton destruction. The culmination of this madness was the sack of Novgorod in 1570. Novgorod was one of Russia's oldest and wealthiest cities, a proud commercial republic that had always maintained a degree of independence. Ivan became convinced the city was plotting to defect to Lithuania. He led his oprichniki there himself, and for 5 weeks they subjected the city to a systematic and unimaginably brutal massacre. Chroniclers, likely exaggerating but capturing the essence of the horror, claimed that thousands of people, men, women, and children, were rounded up each day, tortured, and then tied to sleds and driven into the icy Volkhov River. The city was burned and plundered, its wealth confiscated, its political and economic power broken forever. Ivan, the unifier of Russia, had become the destroyer of its greatest cities. During this period, he seemed to take a personal, hands-on interest in the application of cruelty. He established his court at the Alexandrov Sloboda, a fortified compound that became his personal fortress and torture chamber. Eyewitness accounts speak of a bizarre daily routine where Ivan would alternate between fervent, prostrate prayer in his chapel and personally presiding over the torture of his prisoners, inventing new and excruciating ways to inflict pain. For Ivan, there was no contradiction between his profound Christian faith and his monstrous cruelty. He saw himself as God's wrathful hand cleansing Russia of its sins. The screams of his victims were, in his mind, perhaps a kind of prayer. His rage was not reserved for his political enemies. It could erupt at any moment against anyone. The most famous and tragic example of this was the death of his own son and heir, Tsarevich Ivan Ivanovich, in 1581. In a fit of uncontrollable anger, supposedly during an argument over his son's wife, the Tsar struck his son on the head with his heavy, iron-tipped staff. The blow was fatal. The heir to the throne, the future of the dynasty, lay dead at his father's hand. The famous painting by Ilya Repin captures the aftermath. The Tsar, his eyes wide with horror and disbelief, cradling the body of his dying son, a father consumed by a grief he himself had caused. The murder of his son was the ultimate act of a man whose paranoia and rage had finally consumed everything, even his own future. He had built a centralized autocratic state, but he had done so on a foundation of skulls. And as the user-provided aphorism so aptly states, Ivan the Terrible built a centralized state on a foundation of skulls, but history only remembers the state, not the price of the foundation. He left behind a country that was larger, but also broken, terrified, and economically ruined. The oprichnina had shattered the old social structures and created a vacuum of power that after his death would lead to a period of devastating civil war known as the Time of Troubles. Ivan's fiery public terror was a spectacle. But across Europe, another ruler was proving that the most effective terror is not a raging fire, but the cold, patient work of a spider weaving a web of fear in the shadows. We move now to late 15th century France, a kingdom exhausted and fractured by the 100 Years' War with England. The French nobility was powerful, rebellious, and accustomed to acting as independent kings in their own domains. The task of forging a unified, centralized French state fell to one of history's most unlikely and unsettlingly modern tyrants. He was not a warrior king who led armies into glorious battle. He was physically unprepossessing, dressing in the drab clothes of a common merchant and shunning the pomp and ceremony of the court. He was Louis XI, and his contemporaries called him the Universal Spider, a testament to his mastery of intrigue, espionage, and political conspiracy. He despised open warfare, considering it a crude and inefficient tool. Why waste blood and treasure on a battlefield when a well-placed bribe, a forged letter, or a hired assassin could achieve the same result with far less risk? His weapons were not the sword and lance, but a vast network of spies, a bottomless purse for bribes, and a deep, cynical understanding of human weakness. He ruled not from a grand throne room, but from a small, dark study, spinning his webs of influence that extended into every corner of his kingdom and beyond. He believed that to build a strong France, he first had to break the will of his powerful nobles, and he did so not with an axe, but with the chillingly quiet efficiency of psychological terror. Louis's preferred method of dealing with his most important enemies was not a quick execution. It was a slow, soul-crushing imprisonment. He is credited with perfecting, if not inventing, a particularly diabolical form of torture cage called the fillets, or little girls. These were small iron or wooden cages, sometimes suspended from the ceiling, that were too short to stand up in and too narrow to lie down in. A prisoner was forced into a permanent, agonizing crouch, sometimes for years on end, their muscles atrophying, their mind unraveling from the claustrophobia and despair. This was a cruelty of exquisite patience. Louis understood that a public execution could create a martyr, but a man left to rot in a cage, forgotten by the world, was simply a terrifying rumor, a whispered warning to others who might consider defying the king. His castles, like the forbidding fortress of Loques, became infamous for these silent, living tombs. The walls of his kingdom truly had ears, and the fear of ending up in one of his cages was a more effective deterrent than any army. What is more humane? The swift blow of an executioner's axe, or a decade spent in a cage where you can neither stand nor lie down, slowly forgetting you were ever a man? His reign was the birth of the modern surveillance state. He employed a vast network of spies and informants, rewarding them handsomely for information. No one at court could be sure who was a friend and who was reporting their every word back to the king. He was a master of disinformation, spreading rumors to set his enemies against each other, forging documents to incriminate them, and then stepping in as the benevolent arbiter to solve the chaos he himself had created. He was a pioneer of economic warfare, using trade embargoes and currency manipulation to weaken his rivals. He was also a master of diplomacy, but his diplomacy was that of the back room and the secret deal, not the grand summit. He promised one thing to the Duke of Burgundy and the exact opposite to the King of England, playing them off against each other with cynical brilliance. He trusted no one and was loyal to nothing but the abstract concept of the French crown and his own absolute power. He was famously pious, constantly praying and making pilgrimages, yet he had no qualms about ordering a murder while on his knees in chapel. Like Ivan the Terrible, his faith seemed to exist in a separate moral universe from his political actions. He was the king, and the king's work was, by definition, God's work, no matter how dirty. The Spider King built a modern, centralized France. He broke the power of the great feudal lords, expanded the royal domain, and laid the foundations for the absolute monarchy that would later reach its zenith under Louis XIV. He patronized industry, established new trade routes, and created a reliable postal service, which doubled as an excellent way to intercept his enemy's mail. He was, in many ways, a profoundly successful king, but the price of his success was the creation of a society steeped in paranoia and fear. His subjects were not terrified of a rampaging army or a madman on the throne. They were afraid of a quiet knock on the door in the middle of the night, of a neighbor's whisper, of the king's unseen, all-knowing presence. Louis ruled through an invisible terror, a fear that was all the more potent for being quiet and methodical. He died in 1483, old and deeply suspicious of everyone, including his own doctors, surrounding himself with cages, not for prisoners, but for his own protection. He had built a strong state, but he had done so by perfecting the art of political terror. A few centuries later, another European monarch would take this model of cold, methodical control and apply it on an industrial scale, not to build a nation, but to create a personal factory of death and profit half a world away from the prying eyes of his own people. We now leap forward to the late 19th century, the so-called Age of Empire, a time of supposed progress, scientific advancement, and civilizing missions. Our next monarch was the very picture of a modern, respectable European ruler. He was the king of a small, prosperous, and constitutional country. He was a shrewd businessman, a devoted family man in public, and a great philanthropist. He spoke passionately about the need to bring Christianity and commerce to the dark heart of Africa, to end the Arab slave trade, and to improve the lives of the native peoples. His name was Leopold II, King of the Belgians. And under the guise of this magnificent humanitarian project, he orchestrated one of the largest and most horrific genocides in human history. Leopold's toxicity was not that of a medieval sadist or a paranoid Roman emperor. It was the clean, efficient, bureaucratic toxicity of modernity. His crime was committed not with a sword, but with a ledger book. The greatest atrocities are not always committed by monsters roaring in the dark. They are often committed by gentlemen in suits, signing papers in well-lit rooms. Leopold was frustrated by the limitations of being the king of a small European country. He craved an empire, a source of vast wealth and international prestige that would elevate him and Belgium onto the world stage. But the great powers had already carved up most of the globe. So he turned his attention to the one vast, unclaimed territory left, the Congo River Basin in Central Africa. Using his considerable charm and diplomatic skill, and by making grand promises about his humanitarian goals, he managed to convince the United States and the great powers of Europe to recognize his personal claim to a territory of nearly 1 million square miles. It was not a Belgian colony. It was the personal property of one man, a private fiefdom he called the Congo Free State. It was one of the greatest confidence tricks in history. He promised to protect the natives, to build hospitals and schools, and to promote free trade. Instead, he turned the entire country into a massive slave labor camp designed for a single purpose: to extract as much wealth as possible, as quickly as possible. The initial target was ivory, but the real boom came with the invention of the inflatable rubber tire. The Congo was rich in wild rubber vines, and Leopold had a monopoly. He created a private army, the Force Publique, staffed by European officers and local conscripts, many of whom were kidnapped as children and brutalized into submission. This army's job was not to defend the state, but to terrorize the local population into meeting impossible rubber quotas. Every village was given a quota. To meet it, the men were forced deep into the jungle for weeks at a time to harvest the sticky, dangerous latex from the vines. The work was grueling and often fatal. If a village failed to meet its quota, the Force Publique would arrive. Their methods were designed for maximum terror. They would massacre the inhabitants, burn the village to the ground, and take the women as hostages, holding them in rape camps until their husbands or fathers delivered the required amount of rubber. But Leopold's agents soon developed an even more grotesque and infamous practice. To prove to their superiors that they were not wasting bullets on hunting animals, the soldiers of the Force Publique were required to present the severed right hand of a person for every bullet they fired. This created a gruesome currency of human flesh. If a soldier used a cartridge to shoot a monkey for food, he would cut the hand off a living child to make up for it. The result was a Holocaust. Baskets of severed hands became a regular feature of life at the collection posts. Photographs taken by brave missionaries and reformers like Alice Seeley Harris, showing Congolese men staring at the severed hands and feet of their 5-year-old daughters, finally exposed the horror to the world. The population of the Congo Free State is estimated to have declined by as much as 50% during Leopold's rule. As many as 10 million people perished from murder, starvation, exhaustion, and disease. It was a genocide driven by corporate greed. All the while, the vast profits from the rubber trade, billions of dollars in today's money, flowed directly into Leopold's pockets. He used the money to fund lavish construction projects in Belgium, building grand avenues, museums, and monuments. The people of Brussels and Ostend strolled through beautiful parks and admired ornate archways paid for with the blood and agony of a people they had never met. Leopold's evil was so effective because it was hidden, outsourced to a distant continent, and managed through a corporate structure of exploitation. He never set foot in the Congo himself. He was insulated from the horror by layers of bureaucracy and thousands of miles of ocean. His was the clean-handed evil of the modern age. Eventually, the work of whistleblowers, journalists like E.D. Morel, and writers like Mark Twain and Arthur Conan Doyle created an international outcry that Leopold could no longer contain. In 1908, under immense international pressure, he was forced to sell his personal colony to the Belgian state. He died a year later, one of the richest men in the world, having never been punished for his crimes. His legacy in the Congo was a land traumatized for generations, its social fabric destroyed, its people brutalized, setting the stage for decades of instability and violence that continue to this day. A genocide for profit is one kind of horror, a calculated impersonal evil, but what of a terror, fueled not by greed, but by the desperate private anxieties of a single man? What happens when a king's obsession with what happens in his own bedroom becomes a matter of life and death for his entire nation? For that, we must return to England, to a king whose personal drama triggered a religious revolution and who became a real-life Bluebeard sitting on the English throne. He was, in his youth, the very image of a Renaissance prince. Tall, handsome, athletic, and highly intelligent, he was a skilled musician, a talented writer, and a devout Catholic who wrote a treatise defending the sacraments against the reforms of Martin Luther, for which the Pope awarded him the title Defender of the Faith. When he ascended the throne in 1509, King Henry VIII of England was the hope of his nation, a charismatic and energetic ruler who seemed destined for a glorious reign. He married his brother's widow, Catherine of Aragon, and for nearly 2 decades, their marriage was a stable and successful partnership. But it had one fatal flaw: it failed to produce a male heir. Catherine gave birth to 6 children, but only one, a daughter named Mary, survived infancy. For Henry, this was not just a personal disappointment, it was a dynastic crisis. He was haunted by the memory of the recent Wars of the Roses, a brutal civil war fought over the succession. He believed that only a son could secure his Tudor dynasty on the throne. This obsession, this deep-seated fear for his legacy, would become the engine of a revolution that would change England and the world forever. His reign demonstrates how the most private and personal of a monarch's desires can become a matter of public policy with earth-shattering consequences. The focus of Henry's obsession became a young, intelligent, and ambitious lady-in-waiting at court named Anne Boleyn. She refused to be his mistress, holding out for the ultimate prize, the crown. Enamored and desperate for a son, Henry became convinced that his marriage to Catherine was cursed by God because she had been his brother's wife, a violation of a biblical injunction. He sought an annulment from the Pope. But Pope Clement VII was in a difficult position. He was effectively the prisoner of Catherine's nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, the most powerful ruler in Europe. The Pope could not grant the annulment without angering the emperor. So he stalled, Henry's patience, never his strongest virtue, ran out. Advised by radical Protestant reformers like Thomas Cromwell and Thomas Cranmer, Henry decided on a revolutionary solution. If the Pope would not give him what he wanted, he would simply remove the Pope's authority from his kingdom. In a series of parliamentary acts passed between 1532 and 1534, Henry VIII severed England's thousand-year-old ties to the Roman Catholic Church, declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England, and had his own archbishop grant him the annulment. He married Anne Boleyn, and the English Reformation began. It was not a popular uprising or a deep theological dispute. It was an act of state driven by the king's libido and his desperate need for an heir. The break with Rome unleashed a wave of repression. Those who refused to accept the king's new title were guilty of treason. The most famous victim was Sir Thomas More, Henry's former Lord Chancellor and one of Europe's most brilliant humanists. A man of devout faith, More could not in good conscience accept that his king was the head of Christ's church on earth. For his silence, he was beheaded. Monasteries and convents, which had been centers of learning and charity for centuries and were symbols of papal authority, were dissolved. Their immense wealth, their land, their gold, their art, was confiscated by the crown, a massive transfer of property that enriched the king and his supporters and fundamentally altered the English social landscape. This was not just a religious change, it was a state-sanctioned looting operation. The king's personal crisis had become the justification for a revolution from above. But fate had a cruel sense of irony in store for Henry. Anne Boleyn also failed to give him a son. She gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth. Having torn his kingdom from its spiritual foundations for her, Henry's love quickly turned to hatred. Accused of adultery, incest, and witchcraft on trumped-up charges, Anne was beheaded on Tower Green, just 3 years after she had become queen. The king married his next wife, Jane Seymour, the very next day. Jane Seymour finally gave Henry what he had always craved, a son, Edward. But she died from complications of childbirth just 12 days later. Henry was devastated, and he would always consider her his only true wife. His next 3 marriages were a tragic farce. A politically motivated marriage to the German princess Anne of Cleves was annulled after just 6 months when Henry found her physically repulsive. His 5th wife, the young and vivacious Catherine Howard, was beheaded for adultery. His 6th and final wife, the pious and intelligent Catherine Parr, managed to outlive the bloated, disease-ridden and increasingly tyrannical king. The handsome athlete of his youth had transformed into a morbidly obese, paranoid monster, his leg oozing from a festering wound, his court paralyzed by fear. His religious policies swung wildly, first persecuting Catholics who refused to break with Rome, then burning Protestants who went further in their reforms than he was willing to allow. The guiding principle of the English Church was whatever Henry VIII believed on any given day. He was the ultimate autocrat, a man whose conscience, desires and fears had become the sole determinant of his nation's spiritual and political destiny. He tore his kingdom apart for a son. But what of a man who would tear the world apart for a legacy written in bone? For our final monarch, we must travel to the heart of Asia to witness a conqueror whose ambition was as vast as the sky and whose cruelty was as boundless as the desert. Our journey through the darkest corridors of power concludes in the 14th century, a world still reeling from the Mongol conquests that had shattered old empires from China to Europe. Out of the chaos of the disintegrating Mongol successor states, a new and even more terrifying conqueror arose. He was not of the bloodline of Genghis Khan, a fact that haunted him and fueled his ambition. He was from a minor Turco-Mongol tribe in what is now Uzbekistan. He was lame from wounds he received in his youth as a sheep rustler, a disability that earned him the Persian nickname Timur-e-Lang, or Timur the Lame, which Europeans corrupted into Tamerlane. But there was nothing lame about his will. He was a military genius, a master strategist, and a man whose appetite for conquest was matched only by his staggering, almost unimaginable cruelty. Timur's campaigns were not just wars of subjugation, they were systematic acts of extermination. He built an empire that stretched from India to the Mediterranean, but he built it upon a foundation of ashes and bones. His unique brand of toxicity was to rationalize mass terror as his primary strategic tool and his signature art form. For Timur, cruelty was not an emotional outburst or a tool of state building. It was the entire point. It was a message, burned into the landscape and written in the language of human skulls. Timur's method was chillingly consistent. When his armies approached a city, he would offer terms of surrender. If the city submitted without a fight, it would be spared, though heavily taxed. If it resisted, its fate was sealed. Once conquered, the city would be subjected to a massacre so complete and so methodical that it defies easy comprehension. He did not just kill soldiers, he exterminated populations, men, women, children. No one was spared. But he did not stop there. He turned the evidence of his slaughter into monstrous monuments. After conquering the Persian city of Isfahan in 1387, his soldiers were ordered to each bring back a quota of severed heads. From these, they constructed more than 24 towers made entirely of the heads of the city's 70,000 inhabitants, cemented together with clay. These ghastly structures were left standing as a warning to any other city that might dare to defy him. A decade later, after crushing a rebellion in Delhi, he ordered the slaughter of 100,000 Hindu prisoners in a single day, building more pyramids of their skulls. When he took Baghdad in 1401, he had 90,000 of its residents beheaded, their heads piled into 120 towers. He was not just a conqueror, he was an architect of horror, creating a landscape of terror that would be visible for miles and remembered for centuries. What kind of mind conceives of such acts? Timur was not an unhinged madman like Caligula. He was a devout Muslim, a patron of the arts and architecture, and a brilliant chess player. His capital city of Samarkand became one of the most beautiful cities in the world, filled with magnificent mosques and observatories built by the artisans and craftsmen he spared from his massacres and forcibly relocated. This is the terrifying paradox of Timur, the same man who could order the construction of a tower of living men layered with bricks and mortar in Sistan could also sit with philosophers and poets to discuss the nature of the divine. His cruelty was not emotional, it was entirely rational. He understood that his empire, built on conquest rather than administration, could only be held together by a fear so profound, so absolute, that the very thought of rebellion would be unthinkable. The pyramids of skulls were not the work of a sadist. They were a calculated act of political communication, the ultimate deterrent. He saw himself as the scourge of God, an instrument of divine wrath sent to punish a sinful world. When your ambition is to conquer the world, human life ceases to have any individual value. It becomes a resource, a statistic, a building material for the monuments of your own glory. He died in 1405 on the march to conquer Ming China, the one great prize that had eluded him. His vast empire, held together only by the force of his personality and the terror he inspired, quickly fractured and fell apart. He left behind a legacy of destruction that set back the cultural and economic development of Persia, Mesopotamia, and India for generations. Flourishing cities were turned into deserts, ancient irrigation systems were destroyed, and entire populations were wiped from the face of the earth. He was the ultimate expression of power as a purely destructive force, a conqueror for whom creation was merely a byproduct of his true passion, annihilation. He stands at the end of our dark procession as a monument to the idea that a single individual's ambition, untethered from any recognizable human empathy, can inflict a wound on the world from which it may take centuries to recover. His story is a fittingly grim finale to our exploration of toxic power, a final, deafening chord in a symphony of human misery composed by the crowned heads of history. We have journeyed through the centuries, from the petty vindictiveness of a Spanish king to the industrial-scale slaughter of a Belgian one, from the divine madness of Rome to the calculated terror of a Wallachian prince. We have seen how absolute power acts as a universal solvent, dissolving morality, empathy, and reason in the minds of those who wield it. It allowed the inner demons of these 10 individuals, their paranoia, their narcissism, their greed, their fear, to escape the confines of their own minds and become the organizing principles of entire nations, leaving scars on the body of history that are still visible today. The crown may have changed its shape, the scepter may have been replaced, but the poison of absolute power remains. It adapts, it evolves, it finds new vessels. It has learned to whisper where it once roared. This brings us to a final, urgent question. Looking at the world around you now, what do you believe is the greater threat to our freedom and our future? Is it the overt, visible tyranny of a single leader whose iron fist is clear for all to see? Or is it the subtle, invisible manipulation of the many, a system of control so pervasive and gentle that most of us never even realize we are its subjects? Tell us your choice in the comments. The answer may reveal which ghost from this dark past still haunts our present.